Beautiful Tuesday. My name is Dominique McCoy, and I'm the Deputy Director of the 2 and Through Project. And we're really excited to have you for today's 2 and Through Research Spotlight, a new paradigm for funding universities in Illinois that we are hosting in partnership with our friends at the Partnership for College Completion. So I'm going to be hosting for us today, but I have a couple of just quick announcements before we jump in. First and foremost, just wanted to voice over some of the highlights that you all saw while waiting. We have a couple more events for a spring schedule, including an in-person event on June 1st. We'll put a link in the chat for you all to take a look at that if you you're interested in joining us. And then 2 projects that we wanted to highlight from the 2 and 3 side. One, just wanted folks to see that we released a new set of student stories. Again, this is our series that aims to elevate CPS student voice, usually focusing on CPS alumni that are currently enrolled in college. So our newest series is a series of interviews with students that had them reflecting on some of their middle school and high school experiences, how it helped prepare them for college, and try to get some of their pushes and reflections on what worked and what didn't work. And so feel free to take a look at those if you get an opportunity. As well, we are also exploring a new student story series where we're interested in speaking with current CPS alumni who are enrolled in college and on track to graduate in either 4, 5, or 6 years. We are currently doing some research to understand patterns of college completion and timing, and what are some of the challenges and barriers that are plans that students have to build out their college pathways. And so we'd love to, if you have access to students, if you're working with students, we'll put some information in the chat. We'd love for you to help us spread the word so we can speak with many more alumni. My teammate Jessica Vargas is leading that project, and we're really excited to hear from students' reflections and see what we can learn from them. So if you have students be interested in participating, please feel free to pass along that information. A couple of logistics before we get started. So at the bottom of your screen, you will see a button that should say Q&A. We are going to be hosting Q&A portion of this session towards the end. And so would love for your questions to come in as the presentation is going, so we can elevate those for discussion at the end. As well as if there's kind of more clarifying questions, we will have some of the team members from PCC will try to tackle those as they're coming in real time. Last logistical note, if you RSVP'd for this session, you should have received a calendar invite for an optional post event discussion. We like to host these spaces just to provide people with an opportunity to understand who else in the space in our city and our state is interested in this topic today. And so we'll have an opportunity to join a separate Zoom room, have some small group discussion. We have a couple of discussion questions to try to make some meaning of some of the amazing information we're going to get here today. So if you're interested in joining at the end of the presentation, we'll provide some more information on that Zoom room, and we'll jump over as soon as we finish here. And finally, if anyone knows anything about our work, you all know we are big believers in data. We believe that data can be a really powerful tool to disrupt inequitable systems. And we think it is a really powerful starting place to first and foremost just understand what is happening to students so that we can actually try to work together to do something about it. So that's why we are so excited about today's presentation and the team from Partnership for College Completion, because this work really touches on all of that. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to the Executive Director of the Partnership for College Completion, Lisa Castillo-Richmond. Go ahead.
Thank you so much. Hello, everyone. My name is Lisa Castillo-Richmond, as Dom mentioned, and I have the privilege of serving as the Executive Director of the Partnership for College Completion. I want to thank you all for joining us for our report launch today. And I want to give a special thank you to our co-hosts and longstanding partners and collaborators at the 2 and Through Project, Don McCoy and Alex Seaskin. It's always an exciting day when PCC releases a new report, and I'm so pleased to be here in partnership with you to discuss exploring equitable public higher ed funding models in Illinois. Many of you are familiar with PCC, but for those of you who may not be, PCC is an Illinois-based and Illinois-focused nonprofit organization that was launched in 2016 to bring systems-level solutions to issues of higher education equity and degree completion in the state. I want to set the context to talk about why we're here today and why this particular report. In the spring of 2021, the legislature passed Senate Bill 815. This bill created the Commission on Equitable Public University Funding, a 33-member bipartisan bicameral commission that has been convening since November 2021 to chart a path forward for the first ever public university funding formula in Illinois to determine how future state appropriations are distributed amongst our public universities. Yes, I said first ever. PCC and a number of our partners have served as commissioners, and we have equally matched the efforts to advance this work off of the commission, including through the Coalition to Transform Higher Education Funding and the collective efforts of individuals and organizations to make the case for a funding formula, help shape that formula, as well as raise concerns of students and others to the commission. The basic premise is that we need an affordable, equitable, diverse higher education system in our state, and the right funding formula is a critical part of that equation, one that meets the current and future needs of our residents and our economy. Why does it matter so much? Well, 95% of all new jobs created since the recession in 2008 have required a college degree. In the next few years, it is projected that 70% of all jobs will require a 2 or 4-year degree or credential, and that the number of jobs requiring a bachelor's degree is expected to be 10% higher than it was just a few years ago in 2016. An email just this morning from the Center for Education in the Workforce at Georgetown said, quote, "Our predictions about the job landscape of 2031 should offer further reassurance to bachelor's degree holders. The demand for a bachelor's degree will only grow over the course of this decade," end quote. In that context, our state's investment in higher education matters. It matters to affordability, it matters to access, it matters to our state economy, and it matters to social mobility and narrowing the racial income and wealth gap. And our investments and the way in which we invest those dollars will determine if it will be a system that is characterized by equity and excellence or not. That means that whether you choose to go to a college in Chicago, in the northern, western, eastern, southern part of our state, or anywhere in between, the institution you choose to attend, the one that meets your needs, because these are a diverse group of institutions, as they should be, has the resources to offer you that excellent education. So what does that have to do with the report we are releasing today? When economic or political conditions destabilize state funding for public education, the impact is felt unequally across Illinois. The most vulnerable, both students and institutions in higher ed, are the hardest hit. Declining and unstable funding for public higher education leaves less resource institutions with little recourse other than to raise tuition and fees and become even more reliant on tuition to meet budgetary needs. That makes college more unaffordable and further drives down enrollments. Impacted institutions may have no choice but to cut funding to instruction and support services, which many students need to reap the benefits of higher education. The status quo today is that institutions go and fight only for their own campuses and students, one by one in front of the legislature. The process is political and arbitrary and not based on student needs. Higher education in Illinois is stuck in this place where, without an articulated funding system, there's no confidence in making the case for or receiving funding from the legislature, and each round of cuts or additions just makes us more entrenched. This is why PCC partnered with Drs. Fernandez and Hu, leading higher education researchers, to study this issue. This report will serve as the knowledge base, the footnote from which we can consider building our first funding model for Illinois public four-year institutions and a new type of funding model for the nation, one that is based on adequacy and equity. This report will provide important information for policymakers and other stakeholders on why Illinois needs a new funding model, what we know works and doesn't, and makes key recommendations to help move us forward. The students of Illinois cannot wait any longer for funding equity, adequacy, and stability. When more vulnerable students don't receive the support they need, they are likely to leave college without a degree. Not only that, but these students then carry more student debt on average and are more burdened by debt if they don't graduate. Inequitable access to resources on college campuses leads to inequitable economic opportunities for students later in life. Adequately funded universities can change that. It is on us not to accept the status quo. either in terms of current funding or limiting ourselves to models not supported by evidence. That is why this report. Now I'm pleased to introduce our next speakers who will get into the main part of our presentation today and share more about this new report. First, PCC's Senior Manager of Research and Policy, Mike Abramson, who leads our data and research work at PCC, and report co-authors, Dr. Xiaodan Hu, who is an Associate Professor of Higher Education and Student Affairs and coordinator of the Community College Leadership Program at our own Northern Illinois University, and Dr. Frank Fernandez, Assistant Professor of Higher Ed Administration and Policy and affiliate faculty with the Center for Latin American Studies at the University of Florida, to discuss this report. Mike?
Thanks, Lisa. So I am going to dive a little bit deeper into a lot of what Lisa was talking about around college going in Illinois, specifically about what's happened with our 12 public universities, their funding levels, enrollment, what's gotten us to this place in terms of the funding in the funding formula that we're thinking about, that we're thinking through, and the impetus for this report. Then I'm gonna turn it over to Dr. Fernandez and Dr. Hu to talk more in depth about that. So basically the report has 5 sections. The first gives some context on the topic. The second talks about approaches that have been tried in the past, mostly to null or negative results. The third talks about the promise of a new kind of model, as Lisa mentioned, that could base funding in what students at universities actually need to succeed and what those universities need to support those students. The fourth dives into the specifics of Illinois funding, and the final section gives 7 recommendations that policymakers, institution leaders, and other stakeholders should consider. So what I'm going to present now is going to somewhat overlap with sections 1 and 3. So sorry for any thunder that I'm feeling, but I definitely encourage everyone to read the report, which is now live on our website for more details on all of it. And to start off, let's go all the way back and again, kind of talk about what Lisa brought up, which is this often we're hearing questions about, is college worth it? And the answer, according to the research and data that we're seeing, is yes. That you know, when we look at the big picture, the jobs of the future are going to belong to those with a college degree, that 95% of jobs since the 2008 recession added to the economy have required college credentials, and then also and the vast majority of those bachelor's degrees. And then if you look at this chart on the right, you can see how having a degree is associated with greater earnings and lower unemployment rates. Off the top of my head, I think that the 12 universities in Illinois average about $450,000 in terms of ROI over the 30 years after getting your degree. So on a personal level, or on an individual level, getting a degree can be transformative. But when we look also at the state level, we know that the future of having a robust, inclusive economy means getting hundreds of thousands more students to and through college equitably. So what's standing in the way of that? Well, you can see here on this blue line, state appropriations to public universities in Illinois over the last 20 or so years, and how that's been essentially cut in half with this large dip around the budget crisis as well. You know, I think with some of the cuts to higher education, there's the thought that, well, costs are rising and, you know, people want to cut costs, but cutting appropriations does not cut costs. It shifts costs, and it shifts costs to students, disproportionately students who can least afford to bear those costs. You can see that in this red line, which is public university tuition tripling over less than 2 decades. All of this being said, well, and what I'll say is that, you know, appropriations for public university operations, it's complex, but the effects of ignoring it are unfortunately painfully simple, and they're inequitable. And all that being said, I think there's this perception that prices continue to rise and spiral out of control. That, however, I'll say, does not appear to be the case in Illinois. Over the last 7 years, if you look at this red line of tuition, prices have leveled off. That said, they've leveled off at an untenably high level for many Illinoisans. We're pricing tens of thousands of students out of college. On an individual level, you can see some data of what that looks like here in terms of debt. Students who receive Pell Grants, so lower income students, take out more than $15,000 to go to our public universities on average, compared to $9,400 for non-Pell receiving students. And these figures are likely larger than the data that we're able to get. And Black and Latinx students pay more to go to our universities as well. Black students pay almost 65% of their family income to go to our universities. That's after financial aid. Latinx students also over 50%, whereas white students are paying around 40%. And so I'll break this down by university types a little bit as well. What we're seeing is there is a difference between what we've seen at our 10 regional universities and our 2 Research 1 universities. At our 10 regional universities, you can see the net price in 2016 became uniquely high. That's the color, basically, is net price that students from low income backgrounds are paying to attend our regional universities. This is by far the highest in the Midwest and second highest in the country. This was in 2016. Meanwhile, across our system, we saw the largest declines in public university student enrollment of any state in the country over this time period. That was driven by declines at our regional universities of almost 30% from 2010 to 2021, whereas our Research 1 universities actually greatly grew their student population. Now, luckily, I can say that this appears to be turning around. Our net price for students from low-income backgrounds in Illinois is no longer the highest in the Midwest. They're uniquely high in the country. And if we look at IBHE's data for the freshman enrollment of 2021 to 2022, we're starting to see this turnaround in enrollment. It's a 5% increase, and that is from our regional universities. And it's exciting to see, right? It doesn't offset the declines, but it starts to. That is, if we can continue along this path, and that this can be a real inflection point. However, funding has a lot to do with that. Is this going to be an inflection point and a turnaround, or will this be a blip in an otherwise downward trend? So to break this down in a little bit more detail, what's the problem with funding? Well, as Lisa mentioned, we don't have a system. Right? And what that ends up doing, along with those declines in half, of appropriations over time, is really hurting universities that are more reliant on state appropriations, which is what this chart shows. It goes, the height of the bars is the percentage of all revenue that comes from state appropriations. Now, 10 of our universities under the current distribution split less than half of our appropriations, while our 2 Research 1 universities receive more than half of the appropriations. You can see in the color here is the average income of applicants to those universities. And as you can kind of eyeball here, the universities that are more reliant on state funds and receive less of them also disproportionately enroll students from low income backgrounds. Unfortunately, the same is also true of Black undergraduates. We see are concentrated at universities that are more reliant on state funds and receive less of them. The picture is a bit more complicated for Latinx students, but one thing that we see is a lack of representation, where only 3 of our 12 universities reflect the state's population of Latinx students. So what we're not saying here is that any university should receive less funding, or that any of these universities currently receive adequate funding. We're also not saying that all of these universities have the same mission or model, or that they should. What we are saying is that we need to fund our universities better and more intentionally. The universities that are currently serving greater percentages of students of color and students from low-income backgrounds need more funding to do so, and our better research universities should enroll student populations that better reflect our state. Question we often get is, why not just give more money to students? Well, we should. MAP, our monetary award program, our state aid, is essential, and there's no substitute for lowering the cost of college by better funding student aid. But as Lisa also mentioned, that doesn't help universities fund the services and instruction that they need to help keep students in college. So that's why we need to adequately fund our universities as well. So all of this was the impetus between Senate Bill 815, which created the Commission on Equitable Public University Funding, which is scheduled to give recommendations by July on how we're to adequately, equitably, and stably fund our universities. But as Lisa mentioned, we need a research basis to thoughtfully embark on this work, and that's where the report by Dr. Fernandez and Dr. Hu wrote will be so, it's going to be so essential for that. So with that, I will pass it over to them to describe the report in more detail.
Thank you so much, Mike. I'm Frank Fernandez. I'm at University of Florida. Thank Xiaodan, who's not on camera, but is here. And, oh, there's Xiaodan. And one of my PhD students, Matt Capaldi, who's not with us today, but was really instrumental in the analyses that went into this report. Thank you to BCC really quickly and the folks at To and Through for hosting this. And I want to say thank you all, who are here. I'm used to speaking to maybe 15 students who are required to attend class, otherwise they lose points. And it's amazing to see so many folks calling in just because they're really interested in the topic. I think that Mike asked us to give a little bit of a background on, how this all started. And the way I think of it is what I tell my students often is it's really hard to beat something with nothing. So this was our first attempt to try to propose a few principles for what adequacy-based funding could look like in higher education. And really that comes out of my prior work, Xiaodan's prior work, looking at performance-based funding and the negative impacts that can have on students, what it can do, kind of create a perverse set of incentives for institutions, which we'll talk about later. But so out of that, in our initial conversations, we talked about, could we do some data modeling? Should we be trying to, specify a specific formula? And pretty quickly, we decided we need to take a step back and think, broader and a little bit more conceptual. So when you try to conceptualize adequacy, the natural place, I think, for us to start was to look at funding in Illinois and try to work backward, right? In what ways is the system inequitable or inadequate at this point? As Mike was saying, we certainly advocate for more individual financial aid to students, to improve affordability. But we had a couple reasons we completely kept that out of this report. One of them, I do some work on regulating for-profits, and when you give kind of portable money to students, the money follows the students instead of the institutions. The large for-profit providers tend to be really, really agile and savvy at finding those students, the ones who are more likely to take on debt, low-income students, people of color, and get the aid from them. And then those institutions have really low retention rates and graduation rates. So once you open that spigot, then you have to try to do a whole lot of things in different states to try to protect those public funds from basically being paid out to shareholders. Secondly, as we saw recently with the union strikes in Illinois, institutions need to be better funded just to be able to pay faculty living wages, right, in expensive cities. And again, providing direct financial aid to students does not immediately solve that problem. So Mike, if we go to the next slide. What we did to kind of start off, we call it an emerging approach, but that's really for higher ed. What we did was we started by drawing on arguments, analyses, and honestly, litigation that comes out of K-12 space. So in the years leading up to the pandemic, as of 2017, there had been lawsuits across 46 states about whether schools, elementary schools, high schools, were being adequately funded. In almost half of those states, in 22 states, funding formulas were found to be unconstitutional under state constitutions. What we then see is when there's a court order that states have to provide more funding to their public schools, high school graduation rates actually increase, and those increases can vary across the states, but across those 22 states, increases have varied from 7% to 12 percentage points. And so this is huge, right? When we fund schools the way that they should be funded, we see improved outcomes. Something we don't see under other funding approaches like performance-based funding. So where this really, we say we recognize all these things, really the shifting paradigm is we have to go back to thinking about education as a public good and not as a private good. That we all benefit from investment in higher education. Whereas if you think of it as a private good, what we kind of default to is you get what you pay for, right? Well, students who can pay higher tuition should get better, higher education. And I think that we philosophically start from a different place, right? Is that when you have a statewide completion agenda, as Illinois does, as most states do, we can't really meet those completion goals unless we focus on lower income students, racial minority students, who are often the least likely to be able to graduate, and are often underprepared because of inequitable funding in K-12. This also moves away from ideas about meritocracy. Xiaodan and I have done a lot of work on merit aid programs, and the different ways that states create metrics for measuring merit, which can be arbitrary and subjective about how do we measure merit. So instead, we start with kind of these points. Schools should get, institutions, public four-year schools, should get what they need to serve their students equitably, and give them all chances to succeed and do well. Recognizing that institutions across Illinois serve very different populations with very different needs. You've got urban, you've got rural. And that when you have uneven investment across the universities, this is what Xiaodan will talk through. We can see how it affects enrollment, how it affects affordability, how it affects social mobility, and just a broader opportunity to offer wraparound services to help students who are often housing insecure, who can be food insecure, who have all sorts of unmet needs that influence their ability to succeed and thrive in higher education. So with that, I think Michael changed the slide, and I'll turn it over to Xiaodan.
Thank you. So I'll try to walk through our report without giving away too much details. So there's quite some information we included in the front end of the report to look at where we are, our current funding system, and what can we do better to support our students attending or aiming to attend a public four-year university in Illinois. In section 1, we introduced some policy context and how the level of state appropriations, as Mike mentioned earlier, has been steadily declining after accounting for inflation. So part of it was determined by the current funding model in Illinois, and the decrease may be linked to declining student enrollment. But what is often overlooked is how public four-year universities can be influenced differently depending on their institutional characteristics, right? Some institutions experienced larger fluctuation in enrollment, and some had more stable enrollment, as you can see from this figure. That leads to different levels of reliance on revenues from state appropriations and also revenues from tuition and fees. So when states cut spending to their public higher education system, public colleges only have two realistic short-term response options, right? One is to cut spending, or they increase other revenues to maintain their revenue, their expenditure level. So in this section, we talked about research on how reducing investment in higher education has a detrimental impact on student success, especially thinking about the post-secondary access and achievement gap, or in a different term, the educational debt we owe to our students from marginalized backgrounds. Neither a budget cut nor a tuition increase is an ideal solution to support our students. Next slide. Thank you. And then in section 2, we revisited the common state funding models and the pros and cons of these models. So in Illinois, state appropriations to public four-year institutions are largely based on this base plus budgeting method. It's a combination of the existing share of state funds and other justifiable new expenditure items, right? New facilities, new programs. And we talked about relevant research and how this particular funding model may overlook changes in student enrollment, economic conditions, and demographic trends. Instead, it relies on precedent, and there are negotiations in the process, and that leaves quite some room for inequity in funding distribution. Then there's performance-based funding model, which has been evolved over the years and become popular across the states. Current research on this topic mostly agree upon the null and negative unintended outcomes. I mean, if you think about it, right, the concept of performance-based funding model highlights accountability. So it's really difficult to achieve equity and funding adequacy in the meantime. These concepts and assumptions can be incompatible sometimes. So at the institutional level, certain outcomes may be achieved at the cost of equity when you overemphasize some of the completion indicators. Institutions tend to deprioritize authentic student learning, which, right, to be fair, it is really difficult to be captured, measured, and quantified. But then if you have a really small proportion of state funding tied to performance, there's just not a strong enough incentive to influence institutional behaviors. And all of this is really difficult to figure out. So in the process, we think it's important to lay out some of these goals and dilemmas and see what can be done. Next slide, please. So one question we've been thinking is, before we ask public universities to be accountable for their outputs and outcomes, do they even have the capacity to support their students and achieve these goals? So in chapter 3, we introduced the concept of funding adequacy and talked about how it was derived from the K-12 system. As Frank mentioned, we explored funding adequacy as a possible option to address some of the historical inequities in higher education, right? For example, can we rely on the idea of funding adequacy to particularly support many minority serving institutions that are persistently underfunded by the state government? But of course, K-12 system is very different. Funding adequacy would look different for higher education to achieve its own goals. So thinking about what could support the Illinois public four-year universities to realize the IBHE strategic plans and other completion goals. In this section, we discussed some literature on not just institutional expenditures overall, but expenses in which category: instructional activities, student services, or research expenditures, right? These are all expenditures, but they have varying impact on student success. Institutional mission definitely plays a role in determining where these institutions spend the money, but on top of that, is there also a potential relationship between student composition and institutional expenditure patterns, right? This figure here made us question, do wider schools have more financial flexibility in providing a larger share of wraparound student services? And that's the type of equity-related funding questions we were wondering about as researchers. Then in section 4, we started to picture what are some student-centered considerations for us to keep in mind as we continue to think about funding adequacy. What does it look like for Illinois? We looked at the overall pattern of college enrollments, college completion, and some affordability indicators, such as net price, student loan debt, and social mobility. Without getting into too much details, there is a concerning possibility that it's really difficult for Illinois resident students to equally access Illinois public universities, pay for it without accruing a tremendous amount of student loan debt, assuming they can successfully complete their degree. And many students do not, and we know it, right? So this is especially concerning as we unpack data by separating the highest research institutions and the rest of the regional public universities. When students choose to attend a regional public university thinking, oh, it will be more affordable, that may not be the case based on our descriptive calculation. We're seeing some suggestive evidence that institutional stratification is trickling down to student outcomes and their financial well-being, maybe intergenerational, impact in the future. And we think this report, gives us an opportunity to think about proactively before that concerning possibility becomes a confirmed reality. What can we do, and what should we do now? I'm going to kick it back to you, Frank, for some of our recommendations.
Thanks, Xiaodan. We'll go through these a little bit more in detail, but our quick recommendations are to really think about within state funding inequities. One of the things we wrote in the report is that to the extent that students, many students go to the nearby college, right? It's the one that you've grown up with, it's the one that you know about, maybe your parents went there. To that extent, where you're born in Illinois determines the type of college experience that you can receive, the type of support that you can receive at your public university. And is that something that we're okay with? That kind of, by happenstance, where you're born determines your chances. Certainly, we need to improve equity for Black students, access and success. Mike showed a little bit about that with indebtedness. Yeah, we can go through, I guess we can skip, yeah. And so this is something that we went into more detail in the report, looking at how enrollment has dropped, and part of why Black students are often less likely to make progress through higher education, and is being disproportionately placed in developmental courses, for example, influences retention from year 1 to year 2 and ultimately graduation rates. And again, state cannot meet its, is very unlikely to meet its completion goals for 2030 without addressing these kinds of inequities. We can go to recommendation 3. We talk about restoring the public cuts. And one of the things that we wrote about a bit in the report is really that second bullet point. Inflation is eating away at the purchasing power that institutions have with the dollars that they receive from state governments. And I think that certainly we saw that as a talking point in the recent labor union strikes from faculty at public regionals in Illinois. So the effects that inflation also have on students and on faculty. Sorry, go ahead. Quickly, recommendation 4. We talk about providing equitable levels of funding per student. And so trying to tease apart this idea of so often in higher ed research and policymaking, we think about full-time equivalent students. And yet, many services or many things aren't based off of full-time equivalent status, right? It's kind of this arbitrary idea. Whether you're, so the example we use, one of the examples we use is parking. If you're a part-time student enrolled in 3 units or a full-time student enrolled in 12 units, both of those students need 1 parking spot, right? So we know that often public regional campuses are underfunded, even in terms of just facilities, right? Just having the space to offer students a college experience. And so we push back on this idea of part-time versus full-time, thinking about fixed costs versus variable costs, and different ways that thinking about funding institutions adequately should be able to account for things like parking, things that maybe, that one might seem a little bit silly, but even things like disability services, right? Counseling, where if you're going to be able to provide wraparound services that students need to be successful, it's not clear that it costs less to do that for a part-time student than for a full-time student. And so we propose this idea of considering a funding minimum per student to offer support. For recommendation number 5, we really wanted to push to think about regional competitiveness. As you've seen throughout the slideshow, there have been some really good maps comparing Illinois to surrounding states. We know that other states in the region, tying back to recommendation number 2, can close the enrollment gap between the percentage of the state's population that's Black and the percentage in public regionals of college students who are Black. Illinois is underperforming in that area, and there's an opportunity to do better for our students. At the same time, you saw a similar figure like that for loan debt. So is it equitable, is it adequate to think about the fact that students who go to public four-year universities, not the research ones, not UIUC, for example, graduate with more loan debt than if they, than similar students going to public regionals in the surrounding states, for example, Iowa. And so what do we need to do to correct that? And then we really push on this idea. This is something that I've been working on more broadly about thinking about how to get away from the traditional metrics. For years, we've relied on measures that are really easy. So retention, graduation, right? We've used those because they're relatively easy. Even the ways in which we use those, if we think about first-time, full-time students in college, right? And calculate a 4-year then a 6-year graduation rate off of that. It leaves so many students out of that calculation. Even if you're okay with that calculation, we need to think about, well, just because a student graduated, what if they graduated with crushing debt? What if they graduated in a field and don't have the social capital, right, to just go out and get a high-paying job? So they've graduated, they've got some debt, and then they're really underemployed, right? Either they're not working full-time or they're working full-time, but in a field that doesn't pay a lot. Is that what we want to achieve? And that ties back to some of the work on social mobility that's in the report. Finally, for recommendation 7, again, you've heard this kind of constant refrain throughout, but thinking about, at the least, trying to avoid some of the challenges that we've seen with performance-based or outcomes-based funding. There's very little research to show that it supports student success, as Xiaodan mentioned. No or negative findings generally is what the research indicates. And what we're calling for generally is essentially a paradigm shift, right? The only way to think about funding adequacy is to move away from, as Xiaodan said, these performance-based funding schemes that really rest on a whole different set of assumptions about furthering accountability that prevents conversations about really thinking about equity and student success. Mike, I think that's a pretty good overview. We can certainly answer more questions in the discussion.
I think it's a perfect transition. So we actually have some time set aside for Q&A. As a quick reminder, we've already seen a couple of questions come in, but please feel free to drop your questions using the Q&A function in the chat. And hopefully, if we have time, we'll be able to get to all of those. But I do have 1 or 2 to get us started. So thank you all so much, first and foremost, for this really incredible work where our team's having all these aha moments in the background here too. So really appreciate it. I think you all did a great job of talking about the incredible amount of opportunities that I think some of this research and some of the solutions you proposed provide. But what do you all see as some of the foreseeable challenges to changing Illinois' system of funding based on your research?
I can get us started. I think it's really normal for public universities to be competitive and seek autonomy in the process. And indeed, we have different missions and institutional priorities. Because of all that, it's challenging to find the balancing point of completely trusting the public universities to make the best decisions for student success and equity. And then to the other extreme is a really prescriptive accountability system to micromanage these public universities. You have to do this. So policymakers in universities just need to meet somewhere in the middle. And I can see that process being really challenging. Frank and I were talking about our past research yesterday, and I don't know if you want to give more specific examples of what doesn't work.
What doesn't work? Yeah. I think that Xiaodan and I have written, again, not just about performance-based funding, but also there are a whole slew of different approaches that states have used to try to incentivize institutional, college university behaviors. So, for example, we've written a couple papers looking at Texas where they came up with, it's the Texas Research Incentive Program, TRIP, and created these incentives to try to encourage research production. So let's get the public regionals to focus more on being like research universities. Well, there's a couple problems with that. One, some prior research shows that if you reallocate funding toward research, it actually can lead to a decrease in graduation rates. Set that aside. The policy generally doesn't really work in the way that it's intended to, right? It didn't show, we showed that there were no significant increases in research production. It kind of led to redirecting institutional funds, and one of the goals was also to build endowments. It didn't really help doing that. We've also done this study out of Wyoming that shows similar type of approach, like, well, can we incentivize people to donate to the university? Didn't really find any effects that was successful. And so for decades, that's been the approach, right? Like, let's just create an incentive system and we can get the universities to do what we want them to do. And I think increasingly, there's more research showing that we're really good at creating unintended consequences, and maybe less so at getting institutions to do the things that ostensibly we say we want them to do.
Super helpful. Kind of on the flip side, in some ways, we have a couple questions coming in here. It's really exciting, I think, the opportunity that's been laid out for Illinois to really lead the nation in building kind of the first true equity-based funding model. But in your research, and as you all have been doing this work, have you come across any other states that are kind of moving in the right direction, or ones that you think are getting it right, or more right from an equity perspective?
I think that's a tough one. I think that, as you say, Illinois is kind of on the cusp. I think there are generally the approach that we've seen, Xiaodan, maybe correct me if I'm wrong, is that I call it like a Christmas tree kind of approach, right? We created this funding framework for performance-based funding. And then when we found, when policymakers found that there were unintended consequences to it, they kept trying to tinker around the edges of like, well, maybe we can offset that negative consequence if we create a different incentive. And so it was like, well, we don't want to lose military veterans, so let's create an incentive for retaining veterans. We don't want to lose single mothers, so let's create an incentive for single mothers. And what's bold about PCC's vision is willing to just question that whole approach in general, right? And say maybe we just need to front load equity to begin with, and then work backwards from there.
Anything else we can learn from any other states? Maybe if not exactly funding models to copy, but
I was trying to play chicken because I don't have an answer to that. Some of the K-12 research looking at funding adequacy, of course, we are different, right? We have faculty union, we have a shared governance system, we have all these like online programs that are beyond the geographic boundaries. We're just different from K-12. But I do think they give us some good thoughts about trying to define what kind of equity outcomes are we looking at. I think that's one of the reasons why Frank and we took a step back, because I don't think our institutions and people in general agree upon what equity outcomes are we thinking about? How do we get there? And how much does it cost for us to achieve those equity goals? I think that's a step one question that practitioners and leaders need to figure out.
I think real quick, Dom, what Xiaodan and I wrote a little bit, I wrote it in the chat so I didn't forget. In the report, we would refer back to Chetty's work on social mobility. And they didn't have, I don't think that California and New York specifically tried to lay out a framework like what Illinois, the conversation y'all are starting in Illinois. But we do see that when you have these public systems that are broadly accessible, that are really well funded, that keep tuition low, that have enough funding so you're not canceling course sections the day before the semester starts, and then students can't get the classes they need. You do tend to see that there are several campuses in those states and in those state systems that have some of the highest social mobility rates in the nation. And I think that was one thing that kept us thinking as we kept writing this report. It's like, how do you have Illinois public universities that can really move people from that bottom income quintile up to the top, right? That give people that American dream opportunity that is possible only through higher education.
I can also just add, being an observer and sometimes participant in the commission meetings, that we've heard some really, really helpful presentations from states like Oregon, Tennessee. I know we've looked at in the past Colorado in terms of their funding models, but a lot of these, as Dr. Fernandez and Dr. Hu were describing, are models that have different conceptual and operational approaches than what we're trying to do. So while we can learn and are learning, I think, a lot from different components of them, I don't know if there's any one model we've seen where we can wholesale just copy and paste, which I think, makes this kind of report, I think, all the more important.
We have a question here that it's a little bit different, but something that's been in the news for a lot of folks that watch higher ed closely is the impending decision around affirmative action from the Supreme Court. And so, curious from your all's perspective, as people who think about this often, what impacts do you see that potential decision and the likelihood of those policies being struck down having on efforts to support equitable funding in general, but also equity-based supports in higher ed?
Yeah, I think that this is something that Xiaodan and I mentioned with Mike on one of our phone calls last year, Zoom calls last year, is that the fear, a relatively small number of universities in this country, small percentage, are so selective that they use kind of race-conscious admissions, that they depend on it, right? I think that most institutions 2 years and 4 years are broadly accessible, right? And aren't as competitive as a place like Harvard or UNC, right? The cases that are before the court. What the real fear is from social science is that what we saw out of University of Michigan, for example, that the court decision will be written in such a way that administrators are afraid to even talk about race. And so scholarships for Black students, right? That they're gonna be like, well, we just need to redirect these to any student can apply for the scholarship. And that's the concern, is that if you don't move toward kind of a model like what PCC is highlighted in this report of, we need to think about adequately funding universities so that they can support rural students, low-income students, Black students. It's just going to be harder to have these kind of targeted piecemeal programs that look at trying to improve equity among specific populations. That there are very real reasons and very real studies out there that show that administrators will kind of be deterred and be so afraid of being sued that they're going to get rid of the programs that we've relied on kind of as band-aids to try to support students of color.
I do want to quickly add one point. I know our time is almost up, about some of the research regarding different institutional missions, right? I think there is no like right or wrong. If your research one, you have more money and you're evil. It's not like that. But also, it's at this point, it's really important for us to think of this as a cross-Illinois situation. We want a thriving Illinois, then we need to work collectively to make our higher education system a better place as a whole for students. If they cannot go to an elite institution, more of a flagship institution, if they choose go to a regional public university, would they also receive the same, or depending on institutional mission, a high quality education and affordable education as well.
Thank you so much for that clarification, Xiaodan. And as you mentioned, we are coming up on time. Apologize, we have a ton of great questions here in the chat, but that's also why we have our post-event discussion. So in a moment, we will drop a separate Zoom link in the chat. For those that are interested, we're going to be hosting this space for the next 30 minutes to continue the conversation, continue some of the thoughts and takeaways that folks had from today's presentation. But with that, please join me in thanking the team from Partnership for College Completion